Hello, everyone. There we go. I've addressed the audience a couple times before. I'm very happy to be back here once again. I run the book table out there, and I started a sale this morning, so do check that out. Buy one, get one half off. My title of my lecture today is American Will, American Leaders, American History. And my story begins with the World War II Museum in New Orleans, a place where they once gave me a fellowship. I have a lot to be thankful for the opportunities they gave me. But it is more or less the narratives you would expect to hear about World War II. They have an awful lot of things carved in stone around this strange postmodern structure. It looks rather like a crashed spaceship in the midst of New Orleans. And then below these strange buildings that are going up at odd angles, there are benches with quotes from the founders of the museum, from FDR, from Anne Frank, of course. But you have examples of the establishment narrative there. FDR is quoted saying that the war was to destroy the forces of ignorance, intolerance, slavery, and war. Extremely ambitious. We have the founder of the museum itself, a man named Gordon Mueller, who says that all spiritual and material resources were garrisoned to defeat authoritarian and racist regimes forever. Defeat authority? What exactly would that entail? We see here examples of universal regimes of salvation that are being established by this conflict. There is a religious goal involved in both of these to vanquish evil forever and the like. And it turns out that princes are the sources of salvation in this world. The museum has lots of propaganda posters, some of which are vintage. Some of them have been created for the purpose. You have pictures of black soldiers marching off to war, and they're fighting for equality, the poster says. We see Rosie the Riveter very often in New Orleans, thanks to the World War II Museum. But one of the more interesting things that they've wheeled out and they are proclaiming far and wide is a curious document from Iwo Jima. Someone in the World War II Museum found this and decided to make it the most important speech about World War II. It's called the Iwo Jima Sermon, and it was by Roland Gittleson, a rabbi from Cleveland who described himself as an ardent Zionist. And yet he joined the Marines somehow and made it to Iwo Jima. He very conscientiously imitates the Gettysburg Address, giving a eulogy for the dead after the battle. He says that the war was a fight against hatred, race prejudice, and religious bigotry in the world. That's the purpose of the war, the ends for which it's fought. He says, and I quote, "It's a fight against whoever thinks himself superior." And said, it's just the start of the real fight to come for true democracy in America. Like, this is just the first foray of a larger conflict. Now, when I was part of the fellowship program at the World War II Museum, which I was there with lots of public school teachers, I was one of the few private school teachers that won a spot. They were pitching this. They were saying everyone needs to teach this. This is the best thing that we could possibly teach about the war. And of course, they're forming narratives. They asked me to submit a response to this, and so I titled my response "Holy Volcanic Hellhole About Batman." And said the argument of the speech is just absurd on the face. No one that fought in World War II believes those things. This was extremely odd. So we come to the background here. What are these narratives? We have to ask ourselves, whose story are we telling? And this is something that we encounter whenever we try to teach adolescent how to write. We talk about the parts of a sentence, how to formulate a thought. We talk about the subject, the verb, and the object. And to keep our minds clear, to keep our writing focused, we must ask ourselves constantly, what are we writing about? Who is the subject? and keep that in the forefront. We don't put ourselves in as the subject and say, I think, right? We address our thoughts to the subject directly. And we must ask this question constantly with history. Whose story are we telling? And this delightfully focuses the mind and gives us good focus on what history is about. We see that the standard establishment narrative of our own day is a form of propaganda. It is propaganda against the previous regimes that have governed America. Now, these are distinct regimes. I think that Curtis Yarvin had a very good insight in referring to the various constitutional regimes of America and trying to delineate those and distinguish them one from the other. We might say there are several different versions of the Philadelphia Constitution, several different distinct interpretations, usually aligned with various regimes and dynamic presidencies. One of the things that I'm trying to do, one of my bigger projects right now, that the Old Glory Club gave me a grant to begin, is republishing a series from the 1920s that gives us a good insight into an older regime of history, an older way of seeing American history before our academics genuinely hated Americans and hated American stories. And I'm in the midst of republishing them right now. These are the Chronicles of America series that you see out on my table. These establishment narratives of our own day have gone in a particularly dark direction. They are a death wish made manifest. I talk history for a living now. I go on to cruise ships on American waterways. So I'm constantly stopping in American port towns all over the country. And I tell the story of the Creek War in Alabama rather regularly now. This all begins with the greatest Indian massacre in American history at Fort Mims in South Alabama, north of Mobile. At Fort Mims, over 500 soldiers and civilians were ruthlessly massacred by the Creek Nation. They were surprised. The doors of the fort were unfortunately left open, and they were mostly slaughtered. There were a couple people that managed to sneak away. But I tell this story regularly, and I have very strange reactions from the boomers on my voyages. Occasionally, someone comes up to me after the lecture and say, "Oh, those poor Indians, I wish they had won." And it's a really extraordinary thing to say. You know, it's an elderly white woman. And you think, oh, you genuinely wish that your ancestors had all been brutally raped and scalped and tortured to death and such? That's what you think justice is? You wish your own negation. You wish that you had never lived, that you had never been born, right? This is a really extraordinary thing to hear. But I hear it rather regularly from people with very strange ideas about American history. I had another fellow come up to me just a couple weeks ago. He said, "Why is it that when the Indians win, they call it a massacre?" And well, it's a different kind of victory, isn't it? You know, slaughtering children and the like, torturing people for fun. That's a very different kind of military activity, if you can call it that. So these are interesting things that are manifest in our own time. What has happened here is the dynamic of these historical narratives have become much clearer. There are those that tell constructive stories about what have happened. And there are those that have a genuine death wish and wish their own annihilation. They wish the annihilation of everything they see, everyone they meet. It's really extraordinary. You meet these people and they're talking about the Indian nations. They have never met a Choctaw in their entire life. There are actually very, very few of these people that live today. More of them, perhaps, than have ever lived. In some of these nations, they're bigger than we've ever known them to be in our own time. And they vote overwhelmingly for Trump, which is also very interesting. You might think that some of these Native American tribes are made up of very bitter leftist sorts or something, but that's not the case, and we know that to be true. These boomers, they manifest something that Jonathan Bowden talked about in one of his speeches. The greatest enemy that we have is in our own minds. It is instinctual political correctness. It is stopping ourselves whenever we think an affirmative thought about our people. that this is a dangerous thing, that this is going to lead to terrible results. It's going to lead to violence somehow, or it's going to hurt somebody's feelings. And we stop ourselves from thinking these things and saying these things. The establishment narratives have elevated subversives of all sorts as their heroes. They have made power and choice taboo for heritage Americans particularly. For all other groups, that is encouraged, obviously. They're encouraged to demonstrate. They're encouraged to assert themselves. They're encouraged to talk over people and shut them down, not listen to them, and so on. The establishment narratives are, in our day, they're meant to anathematize actual American leadership in all previous contexts, and also to actively cancel and persecute those that like those leaders. This is part of the story of the campaigns against the various statues we saw in recent years. So the formula is to force heritage Americans to cede power to aggrieved minorities of all stripes. The Iwo Jima sermon is a particularly absurd example of this sort of thing, that World War II was fought to extinguish hate, racism, and religious bigotry in the world. When we ask ourselves basic questions about the conflict, why were Americans fighting in the Pacific? Why did anyone think this was a good idea? We find a very simple answer: because the Japanese attacked us at Pearl Harbor. Whatever we might say about the lead up to that point, that was the impetus. That was the reason why Congress declared war. They were not talking about religious bigotry. They were not talking about destroying hate in the world or something as a goal of this declaration of war. We can find that very clearly in the record, and we discover the meaning of the action and also who was acting. It was not people named Gittleson. Willful leaders have always made American history. All that we call American history is made by willful leadership. In America, all of our history was made by WASPs up until the FDR and JFK administrations, basically. JFK being our first non-Protestant president. These were the people that made the norms in America. They set the social tone. They gave us our language. They gave us our religious traditions, our civic ritual. They gave us our laws. They gave us our architecture. They gave us our food. And we can go on and on, all the various norms. Their manners. We have different regional mannerisms, but we still understand each other. Our body language is not foreign to one another. These are made by the American leaders. Organized antipathy and propaganda to these people is a conspiracy to demoralize and replace this demographic with aggrieved minorities. The monotony of this establishment narrative that I've been talking about, this has resulted in exhaustion. People are sick of hand-wringing gestures in relation to history. This has been a boon for me ever since I've been onto the ships. Now I'm talking to a certain demographic, but they are also exhausted with the endless narratives of guilt and shame that they're constantly bombarded with whenever they hear someone get up and talk about American history. And so a constructive term on these stories, a constructive approach. Why did anyone ever think Andrew Jackson was worthy? Why did he ever make it onto the currency? I hear it constantly from the boomers, who were always my interlocutors. Oh, we need to remember history so that we do not repeat the mistakes of the past. They know this like a liturgy. They always say that, and I always respond, well, he did not make it on the currency because everyone wanted to remember all the things he got wrong. That's not why they painted portraits of him. That's not why they put up statues of him. That was never the case for any of these people. They put them up as icons so we could imitate them. It's the exact same way that it works in a church. The monotony has exhausted the general population. We are seeing, finally, we are seeing some response, some desire for something constructive. This is an incredible opportunity because the alternatives are absurd, like the Iwo Jima sermon. What other alternative heroes do we have thrust upon us out of the ether, seemingly? Harriet Tubman? Someone who left no sources of her own. Someone who is illiterate. There was recently some purportedly scholarly biography, the product of a special studies program at some college. I don't know its context. Maybe he did get some decent sources on this woman. She's incredibly obscure, and yet she will replace Jackson on the 20, so we're told. Other candidates for the $20 bill, Eleanor Roosevelt? That's very strange, but neither of them ever contended for elected office, were qualified for such things. I think Eleanor Roosevelt was ambassador to the United Nations at some point, but really, for the $20 bill, this is all special pleading. These are interested groups that have hijacked history narratives for subversive purposes and for demoralization, specifically for demoralization purposes. It's the older historiography. Anything really before the 1960s, you read it, and their basic perspectives are incredibly refreshing because they know the subject of the work, because they know what American history is about. They take that for granted. American leaders made American history. This is why we like these stories. This is why they're compelling to us. They are not after the obscure subversive who they claim is some American leader. I understand we can pick up quarters now, and we have like Native American astronauts on the quarter or something, as if these are figures of inspiration somehow. Well, I'm sure it inspires a Choctaw, perhaps. That's really nice. I like the Choctaws and all that. But really, no, we're interested in norms. We're interested in leadership. We're interested in who makes these norms in our society. And elevating the most obscure of minorities of all stripes is a tactic of subversion. So this older historiography, it's reasonable, it's organic. This is the natural way to think of things. And so when you tell the stories, people are refreshed by them. They are pleased by them. They're surprised because they may have never heard a refreshing story about these subjects in their life. They've always heard the hand-wringing. They've always heard the guilt narratives. They've always heard, oh, well, we're just so sorry for this. I wish that there was some way to undo our existence in this land. They are not special pleading. They do not require some abstract case of why the person is actually outstanding. It's easy to understand. It's also rare in our world. These books are actively purged. One of the most activist, leftist disciplines in the academy right now is library science. You wonder why the old books are gone from the shelf. They are getting rid of them for political purposes. They do not want them available. At LSU, Sandbatch and I talk about this occasionally. They have gone through and they purged all sorts of priceless works of Southern literature, correspondence, rare essays. They clear them from the shelves, and Sandbatch and I have both picked out these volumes from dumpsters at LSU. The great depository of that kind of literature in particular. That's why people go to graduate work at LSU. And so we have a task to try to preserve these things. Many of them still exist digitally, thankfully. We have a new opportunity because, as we've noted, people are feeling differently. People are feeling more encouraged. They're feeling more vitalized about American stories, about the value of this place, of these particular people that we have here. And they would like to hear something winsome about them. This was the mainstream not very long ago. Just one generation ago, you could go to the bookstores, we could pick up many volumes that would give you those winsome narratives, give you constructive stories about American history. Now it's incredibly rare, as any one of you who have walked into Barnes & Noble knows. Our great leaders, well, they stand behind me, of course, people like Washington, people like Andrew Jackson, people like Lincoln, people, yes, like FDR, as Yarvin loves to remind us. These are the great leaders of history. They form different, distinct political regimes in our history. And after each one of them, there is a pattern of anathemas and diatribes against the losing faction. Obviously, after Washington, the Loyalists, the Anti-Federalists, they are out of favor. But then there is a period where they are reconsidered. They can be rehabilitated. They can be readmitted. The bitter feelings fall away with the passage of time. We see Indians. That's another example. For a time, the race enemies of frontier Americans, constant cycle of strife and war. But we reconsider the Indian case. Now it's very common to tell sympathetic stories about the fate of the Indians. But strangely enough, that was even common in the days of Andrew Jackson, which many of us do not know about. Unreconstructed Southerners being another example, though I'm not sure they've really come back or have been tolerated very much. Old Democrats, old school Democrats, Grover Cleveland and the like, before the Wilson Revolution in the Democratic Party. Another very interesting old regime in history, in perspective. WASP norms themselves are reconsidered now, deconstructed, analyzed. And we see a certain cycle there, and perhaps we're in one of these cycles where we can reconsider the standards of the old regime of historiography. I certainly hope so, because this happens to be a death narrative, and people can't resolve to live if they've ingested these things too deeply. The conspiracy confuses people. This conspiracy against American narratives in history, it genuinely befuddles people so that they ask preposterous questions. I have conversations, it's just part of my job. I was at dinner one night, and the man across the table, he says, "Tell me about the Islamic and Hindu heritage of Louisiana." And I said, "Well, we got the Nation of Islam, but that's homegrown, you know." I said, "As far as Hindu heritage, I know nothing about such things." He's like, "But this was colonial. This was back in the French days." I said, "No, sir, no. There were no people of that description here in colonial days." But he hears this from the talking heads on television. He hears this from people like Joe Biden, who actually did say such things. It was utterly preposterous. This did not exist. This never happened. It confuses people. They don't know what's going on. They think, "Oh, I'm going to Louisiana. I'm going to learn about Hindus." Where would you go? Did they have that in Minnesota? They have so many exotic things in Minnesota. I don't know. We have exotic things in Louisiana too, but so there's genuine confusion from these people. We have all of these sponsored groups of aggrieved minorities with grievance narratives, revenge fantasies, and we incorporate that into the histories that we tell. We have these people that are John Brown fanboys and such. "Oh, I wish that we could have killed all white Southern civilians back when we had the chance," and so on. Really outrageous stuff. But this is commonplace. You find like comfortable, wealthy old grandmothers saying things like that. But it's they say it because they've heard it repeated. They've ingested it like a Christian ingests the creed or the Lord's Prayer. They just say it because it has some ritual significance. It buys them credibility in all sorts of crowds, especially people they believe know history well. It seems to buy them credibility with them, mostly because they're all radical leftists and the like. These are neo-Marxist sorts of narratives, as we know. We don't need any more explanation there. The climactic war to the death between the oppressed and the oppressors and the like. But this is exhausting. This exhausts people. The drama is too much. The implications are apocalyptic. It's the end of their world. It's the burning and murder of everyone they know, everything they've seen. And it doesn't click in their heads because it's just so monstrous and so absurd. They're really surprised to hear a winsome story. They're really genuinely pleased. Even the leftists come to me and they'll say, well, I don't agree with you at the end of the day, but I've never heard someone who liked Andrew Jackson, who found anything to like about Andrew Jackson. And there were things to like about Andrew Jackson, but he's still evil. They say things like that to me, and then they leave me wonderful reviews, and that's great. They assume that I'm some subversive Marxist because they've never met anyone talking about history who wasn't. But it's still a very interesting thing, and it shows me in mainstream America there really is opportunity here. Now, this is particularly interesting to us because we are the Old Glory Club, and we are about telling those stories. We love our country, we love our people, we love our places, our heritage, our traditions. And it's incumbent on us to know these stories. It's incumbent on us to tell them. And more important than the details, always more important than the details, is the attitude you have. If you love what you're talking about, if you love who you're talking about, that will make more of a difference than any number of facts about the narrative. Learn the story, the details of these narratives if they trip you up. Love the stories, love the people. The narratives will get filled with details as you love them. One good example of this kind of thing and the sort of research that I've been doing lately is about Jackson and the Indians. Of course, when people think about Andrew Jackson these days, they're mostly thinking about the Trail of Tears, which is actually wrong because Jackson did not enforce the removal while he was president. He did sign this into law, but it wasn't actually what he asked Congress. Jackson first traveled over the Wilderness Trail and down the Cumberland River in the early days of Tennessee. He saw 4 members of his party get scalped by the Cherokees on the way. This was the start of Jackson's Indian fighting. Jackson had fought the Creek War, which was a particularly brutal war, where nation rose up against nation, and thousands of civilians died on both sides. It was a very destructive war. He captures most of Alabama in the settlement in that war. So Andrew Jackson is in some ways the father of Alabama. But Jackson, though he had personally witnessed unspeakable horrors from these nations, he also made personal remonstrances to various nations, to the Cherokees, who had scalped his friends some years previous, to the Choctaws, who had always been friendly to the Anglo-Americans and promised never to make war on them, to the Chickasaws in northern Mississippi. He went to them. He said, we are at war with the Creeks. We need all the help we can get. And on the strength of his appeal, they all sent warriors to fight under his command in the Creek War. He rallied 3 nations against the Creeks. They came with him all the way down to New Orleans, and they fought at the Battle of New Orleans and beat the British. When Jackson became president, he went to Congress. Speech. He told Congress, these nations are dying. Think of the last of the Mohicans up in New York. The nation is gone. Their folkways, their language disappeared. They've died off or they've assimilated. They no longer identify. The Delawares are gone. The Powhatans are gone. He lists out several of the East Coast nations. And he says, this is tragic. We do not want their ways extinguished from the earth. This is his message to Congress right after he is elected. Are these the words of some hateful bigot? They're the words of an American liberal. Liberal in the best sense, that we like differences, we cherish them, we want to keep them around. We don't want this to be a war of extinction of people or ideas. We want toleration. Jackson says it's impossible to create a state within an existing state. The Constitution specifically forbids it. Also, we will not have multiple codes of law for different ethnic groups in America. We will only have one law, the American law. He says it's incumbent on him as president to maintain these things. Therefore, the Cherokee may not have parts of Georgia. The Cherokee must have a reservation. Yet, Jackson says, I want them to keep their language. I want them to keep their ancient traditions. Jackson then goes to a conference, the only sitting president in our history to go to a tribal council. He convenes one in central Tennessee, in Franklin, Tennessee. It's the Chickasaws and Choctaws, his old allies from the Creek War, who he invites. The president himself addresses a tribal council of these chieftains. And he says, old men, lead your young men to a land of promise, preserve your people and your nation. Are these the words of someone who hates the Indian nations? Absolutely not. He tells Congress in his address, in his first State of the Union to them, he says, it would be cruel to force them off their lands with military. It would be inhumane to do so. I want Indian reservations set up in federal territory in the West, what becomes Oklahoma. I do not want any article in this bill to allow for the forcible removal of the Indians. However, all Indians that stay in state territory must submit to American laws. They must no longer keep their tribal customs because we must only have one law in America. Entirely reasonable. Entirely sensible. No one hears this story. This is the story of Andrew Jackson. Congress gave him something different. They gave him the authority to forcibly remove the Indians. Andrew Jackson never did. Martin Van Buren did. And by the way, Martin Van Buren started removing the Indians during very bloody Indian wars in Georgia and Florida. The longest and most expensive of all the Indian wars, the Second Seminole War in Florida, was the beginning of the forcible removal of Indian nations from the East. And that was after the longest and bloodiest of all of the Indian wars. So I don't think we can blame Van Buren for beginning that process under those circumstances. It made sense to a lot of people at that time. Nevertheless, so we have there WASP liberalism manifest in the policies of Andrew Jackson. We have his Protestant heritage, which fosters toleration between differences. Necessary if you're going to have lots of Protestant sects in one area. They have to tolerate one another. They have to have a difference of opinion and live and let live. This is manifest in Jackson in a different way. This is a generosity to enemies, one of the great heritages of the West. It's chivalrous. This is the man who's seen grandmothers raped to death on the frontier. And yet he says this about the nations. That's big. That's really extraordinary. Most people are not capable of that, who have seen such violence and yet can forgive and say, let's live and let live. Let's let them keep their traditional laws and customs. That's really extraordinary of him. This is not the Andrew Jackson you hear about. This is not the hand-wringing narrative about Andrew Jackson. He subsidizes their cultures. He sets up the federal Indian reservations. That is a unique American experience. That is a unique American policy of generosity to subordinate cultures who cannot compete with the mainstream. We've developed something of a worldwide policy of that sort, the globe as a reservation that we subsidize, right? Because no one can be expected to take care of themselves anymore. Yet we see a degeneration in our own time of some of these ideas. These are part of the American heritage. We have to reckon with that. We have to notice, oh, well, these things obviously are not sustainable, but we can't give up who we are. We can't give up our feelings. We hear boos about the Indian Removal Act in this room, right? The forcible removal of the tribes. We have liberal sympathies towards them now. We don't want to see those cultures extinguished. In that, we have everything in common with Andrew Jackson, actually. So this is an example, the kind of constructive story that we find when we investigate some of these details. But even without those details, if you remember, Andrew Jackson was heroic, and you insist on the point. Nod when someone brings up some episode that you haven't heard of. but can go back to some winsome episode and say, there are reasons people liked this guy. There are reasons why he's an American hero. Go back to that. People are unused to it. That's very rare. Everyone's been used to everyone tearing these people down their entire lives. The ancient regime historiography has a variety of perspectives. It's dependent on demographic. It's dependent on region. Geography has an awful lot to do with it. Famously, the great American regions, the North, the South, the West, they have their different perspectives. They have their different challenges, their different problems, their different people groups, their different conflicts. They have agrarian socialists in Wisconsin, I hear, and Minnesota, right? They're like Scandinavians or something. Is that right? I don't know much about these places. I will go and see them for the first time later this year. I'm going to go all the way up the Mississippi and see Minnesota for the first time. This speaks to the demographics that came into the area. Germans with socialist ideas that settled places like Wisconsin and started new political parties that still exist to this day. More on the state level, but they did elect federal representation as well at various times. These different areas will have different heroes. We will find them in conflict with one another. And we can only really understand those conflicts from more of a local level. We need to know the circumstances of particular places. So we should read regional specific, state specific sorts of histories. We should know the catalog of heroes for our area. Who have people lionized in this place? Their stories make sense from where you stand. And you can be a friendly partisan with Americans that disagree with you, have their own antagonist to your hero. That's okay. We're Americans, we can do that. We are the last liberals in America that can have differences of opinion without destroying each other's lives over it. We can smile when we talk about our differences about Woodrow Wilson, say, how good he was, how bad he was, such things. That's our prerogative because we can still be liberals in that old sense, in the sense that we can tolerate each other. And we can relish those differences of opinion. But we need to know our own people in our own place. We need to know those stories and why those conflicts make sense from where we stand. And we will understand those local heroes when we understand the history behind them, the geography, the groups of people that came in. We then attribute a special honor to that region, to the people who originally settled it, the people of Indiana, the Hoosiers. We'll lionize William Henry Harrison, their one associated man who became president of the United States, who had very innovative ideas about the Union. And he became great because he defeated the massacring Shawnee Nation of Indiana in the War of 1812, pursued Tecumseh into British Canada, and killed the great Indian chieftain at the Battle of the Thames. We will tell the stories of our local leadership because they were the people that made our places. They are the people that formed our institutions. They were the ones that defended their demographic, their settlers, their pioneers in that region when all seemed to be lost, when everyone was running because they did not want to be massacred. He stood and fought. He was heroic, and that is why they remember him. That is why they lionize him. The old left, the old right in this American historiography, they all recognize those realities of leadership better than our own establishment does. It is our duty to ingest those stories and tell those stories, share those stories. We need to know the stories of our people. We need to know the stories of our place. Now, this is our own subversion from the right. When we talk about our people, we talk about the people of a particular place. We're talking about blood and soil. It's another one of these ways we can approach these things. It resonates with people because it's natural. People naturally think in those ways. It's naturally meaningful to point out those distinctive things. And it brings these characters to life when we talk about the circumstances that they find themselves in, where they made their great willful choice. They took their stand. They fought their war in the particular spot in which they did it. That right there. Why would he take a stand? Because he had obligations to people? Because he would rather die than see them murdered? Why did he do it there? It's because he had a tie to that land. That's why. The alternative is the absurdities of the World War II Museum. The increasingly ridiculous things we find in Barnes & Noble. I was reminded of Radliff's speech last year. I was walking around Paducah, Kentucky just recently on a private tour, and the gentleman wanted to talk to me about a book called 1492. And he says it's a bestseller. I think I've seen this book. But he tells me the Native Americans, they built fabulous hydroponic farms. They built aqueduct systems. The ships that were off the coast, the East Coast, at the first discovery of what became the United States, they saw thousands of bonfires on the beach because there were millions of inhabitants. And I assured him this was all poppycock. That this is not at all the case. I've read the sources myself. I have no idea what this book is talking about, and I may be completely misreporting its thesis because I have not read it. I'm not at all inclined to. But it's the sort of thing that you find on the bookshop shelf these days. That's what's mainstream. It's really wild and outrageous claims. An alternative to this, and one of the reasons why I'm working on projects that I am, is the Chronicles of America. This series was inspired by a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave when he was the president of the American Historical Association. He called for regional and topical histories written in a literary way for American audiences. So a professor at Yale then commissioned the outstanding scholars of the day, men of the early 20s, to write 50 histories of the United States, from pre-Columbian America all the way up to Woodrow Wilson, who at that point was a candidate for Mount Rushmore, believe it or not. But this is an establishment history of the day. It is before these scholars, to a man in our day, practically, believe that America is a hateful thing. John Lukács, a Hungarian-American historian who came over here during World War II, he wrote a book of historiography called Historical Consciousness. He said, history is a form of memory organized and defended with evidence. When we say a form of memory, we notice that people can have different memories of what has happened, and they have their own reasons for thinking so. I was talking to a psychologist this morning, and we were talking about that very thing, how people form their own narratives based on what they experienced, and how they need to work these things out on occasion when it doesn't mesh well with circumstances. History is that way. People have their loyalties. People have their ideas. They organize the facts that they hear according to those loyalties, according to those ideas. Which is why the attitude, once again, you'd have one thing to take away from this lecture. It is this: having a positive attitude about our people and our places makes all the difference in the world. You love them, you love your place, you love your people, you will love those stories. You will tell those stories because they are meaningful, because they make a difference in people's lives. It gives them identity. And this is something that people need these days. They're being sold crap identities off of social media. They need something better. People demand some quality. So, know the stories, tell them. Outstanding in our heritage. As Bowden said in one of his speeches, we reject the weak and effeminate ideas of our own culture. These formulations that make it an emasculated thing, to make everyone afraid of making choices, of taking stands. because they stand to lose too much by doing so. Someone notices. We reject that. That is not for men, that is for slaves. And it deracinates the entire country. We see the beautiful things, the meaningful things in our country being rejected, being trashed. We uncancel the old stories, the old history. We challenge these establishment narratives that have Andrew Jackson as some stupendous bigot, some pre-modern fascist or some such thing. The death wish that is so prominent in those narratives, we should point it out. Do you really wish my ancestors were dead? Do you really wish your ancestors were dead? You really wish they lost? What has come from their victory? What do you see around you? You claim to love obscure and barbaric nations. Do you actually know these people? Are they your neighbors? Do you happen to live around them? Why not if they are so wonderful? Challenge them. Ask them questions. Push back. We must push back against the modern age as hard as it pushes against us. Places, people, natural ties of religion and kinship, these are the motivating, the meaningful things in human lives. Excellent things. Love, that make us sacrifice, and we will be called on to make these sacrifices. We need to have ourselves based in these things. And ultimately, it is things like place and people. It is also, very importantly, things like the Ordo Amoris, the order of loves. We owe more to our wives because they are our wives. We owe more to them than any other women in the world. We owe more to our children because they are our children, not just random young people. We owe more to our fellow citizens than we do to Bangladesh. And this is obvious. This is true. That is actually the definition of morality. And beware anyone that counter-signals on those points. Because counter-signaling on those points in my history, that has been the destruction of entire careers. The heritage of leadership, hierarchy, fraternity, the paternal leadership, the recognition that not everyone can take care of themselves. We take care of children. They need paternalism. We take care of our wives when they stay at home with the baby. That is paternalism. That is patriarchy. We take care of subordinate nations like the Choctaws who could not compete with the Americans. That's paternalism. And I think most of us would think it would be incredibly cruel to force them all to compete, fend for themselves an arbitrary notice. At the very least, they must be prepared for it so that we don't see famine and starvation. We would consider that inhumane. We consider that barbaric. And that is because we are Anglo-American. We are heritage American. We have the tradition that regulates our behavior in these matters. We want to be humane. Like Jackson said in his speech to Congress, we do not want these people looking back on us and accusing us of evil doing towards them. That's what Jackson said when he proposed the Indian Removal Act. That was his justification for it. Extraordinary to think, but that's what he thought, that's what he believed, and so do we. We want to be thought of that way too, because we believe in honor. And not everyone does. So, we have a manly heritage of responsibility. These excellent things, they will endure. That is Andrew Jackson's legacy. That is our heritage. That is our responsibility. We are Americans. We must tell American stories. We must love America. Thank you all so much. Thank you all.